Good morning, everyone. Hope you are all doing well. Welcome to our Stories Have Always Been Our Governance speaker series, Urban Indigenous Governance Justice Panel. My name is Becky Sisakamus-Kuffner. I'm from Atakakook Cree Nation in Treaty 6 territory, and I live and work in Saskatoon. And I'm very pleased to be the moderator of this panel this morning. Justice is an important principle in our society, and at its heart of justice is moral rightness, fairness, and truth. And our justice system in Canada often has been known to fail Indigenous people because those principles of moral rightness, fairness, and truth have not been upheld, and it has impinged upon the dignity and worth of people. So it's quite fitting today that we have this panel on justice with our three speakers on this National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, when we recognize that residential schools have also had incredible impact on the dignity and worth of Indigenous people. So it's my pleasure to welcome Senator Kim Pate, Chantal Genier, and Justin Campbell to our justice panel. If you'd like to please take a minute to quickly introduce yourselves. We're starting with Senator Pate.
Great. Thank you very much for Becky. And please just call me Kim. I'm very pleased to join you from the shores of the Kitchissippi, the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, otherwise known to many folks on Turtle Island as Ottawa. And I've just come from the Hill, and I'm just racing back to be able to join the folks, particularly survivors who are here today to commemorate those whose spirits and lives were lost. And then so I am happy is probably not the right word, but I am, I'm honored to be and humbled to be invited to join you to talk about some of the injustices that continue, that are perpetuated and perpetrated by the government as we continue this work.
We're very pleased to have you, honored as well. Thank you. Chantal?
Good morning. Thank you. My name is Chantal Genier. My traditional name is Shutski. I'm a member of the T'Unquichin Council here in Yukon, and I'm currently working as the Senior Justice Analyst for the Council of First Nations.
That's great. Thank you for being with us this morning, Chantal. Justin?
Hey everyone, and thanks a lot to Newick for inviting me to join this panel. I'm excited to see where this so my name is Justin Campbell. I'm a white settler trying my best to be a good ally to the urban Indigenous community in St. John's, which is located on the unceded and traditional homelands of the Beothuk, whose culture has been extinguished and is now lost forever. St. John's is also found on the unceded traditional homelands of the Mi'kmaq as well. I'm the program manager responsible for First Voice, which is the Urban Indigenous Coalition in St. John's. I'll have more to say about that and some of the work that we're doing. So I think that's it. Thanks again for inviting me to the panel.
Thank you, Justin. I look forward to your presentation, and thank you for your allyship. I would like to start with a presentation from Chantal, our local organization. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I thought today I would just I circulated a copy of the executive summary from the Sharing Common Ground, which was the review of Yukon's police force that was undertaken in the Yukon. I think it was completed in 2014. And I just wanted to talk a bit about the work that was done then, because we're actually revisiting this. We're sort of doing a review of the review that took place. And I thought I'd start a little bit with just some background and the sort of catalyst that set us on this course in the Yukon. And I was fortunate enough at the time to work with the justice manager at CYFN that was a co-chair in this process. So what led to this review were, of course, the sort of ongoing difficulties, difficult relationship and concerns and issues around the treatment of Yukon First Nations people at the hands of the RCMP. And the RCMP is the only police force that we have in the Yukon. We don't have First Nations police, and we don't have municipal or territorial police. So really, there was this sort of ongoing legacy and history, of course, that many other jurisdictions struggle with in terms of the history of enforcement of policies, especially related to residential schools. So there's this sort of, history with the RCMP that was sort of lingering. In any event, there were a couple of incidences in particular that were pretty terrible and actually horrific. There was a First Nations man, Raymond Silverfox, that was held in police custody in this sort of drunk tank and for 13 hours, and he unfortunately passed away. But during the time that he was in custody, there were videotapes of the officers that were supposed to be monitoring him, sort of ridiculing him and treating him really just without very much dignity. So that created a big outcry for Yukon First Nations people, as you can imagine. And not long after that, in one of the communities just south of Whitehorse in Watson Lake, there was also some charges that emerged against two of the RCMP members there in relation to sexualized assault. And so these two incidents in particular sort of became the catalyst for the need for this review to take place. So at the time, the way policing works in Yukon is it's a cost shared agreement between Government of Yukon and Government of Canada. And so Government of Yukon and the RCMP determined that they would launch a review. And at the time, Council of Yukon First Nations, being a sort of umbrella agreement that represents all the interests of all Yukon First Nations, even though Yukon First Nations, 11 of the 14 have self-government agreements, there still was determined the need for Council of Yukon First Nations to continue to represent their interests and needs, especially in cases like this. So Council of Yukon First Nations actually had to fight to be asked to be a co-chair in this process. So that in and of itself sort of tells us at the time that how sort of government and RCMP felt about the relationship. So in any event, they were asked and invited to be co-chairs. So at the time, it was the justice manager for CYFN, who was the co-chair, Simone Arnold. And like I said, I had the pleasure of working directly with her on this process. And so the executive summary does sort of talk a little bit about the process that was undertaken, all of the engagement, how they focused their sessions to speak to as many Yukon First Nations citizens and other citizens as much as possible to just talk about what some of the issues, concerns, and the level of trust and confidence in Yukon's RCMP, known as M Division. So that took place over at least a summer. And really, what sort of came out was that there were a number of folks that felt that there was a real lack of, like, the overriding theme was a lack of trust. And certainly folks noted that there was a real need for more culturally relevant training and knowledge that would help address some of these issues of trust. So after doing all of the engagement, the co-chairs did write a final report, and they actually called it, that contained a number of recommendations. So it actually contains 33 recommendations, and it was called Sharing Common Ground. And that was presented to the legislature and filed there. And then it was decided that there would be a process of implementing the recommendations. So then Sharing Common Ground sort of turned into a process of, it was sort of administered by Government of Yukon, and, you know, working groups were created and resources were sort of allocated to sort of tackle these recommendations. And in the executive summary, you'll see near the end at page 11, it does lay out all of the recommendations. And they're pretty, some are quite broad in scope, some are quite easy to sort of tackle, some are pretty straightforward. And really over the course of 3 years, these recommendations were sort of tackled. And I guess at the end of that 3-year period, there was sort of a decision made, I would say largely on behalf of Government of Yukon, to sort of sunset the process. And at that time, CYFN certainly had concerns that maybe some of the recommendations were not fulfilled to the extent that they could have been to really affect meaningful change, especially for Yukon First Nations people. But of course, there was a lot of dialogue and discussion around some of the challenges associated with fulfilling some of the recommendations in a real meaningful fashion. So the decision at that time was to sunset the work and sort of task some of the existing working groups with continuing on and incorporating some of the recommendations into their mandate and sort of tackling the work. So that sort of officially ended in 2014. And over the years, of course, with the work of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Women and Girls and LGBTQ2S+ individuals, we of course learned more about the issues and ongoing concerns, and racism is prevalent in policing. I had the pleasure at that time of working with Minister Jeannie McLean, who is the Minister of Women and Gender Equality here with Government of Yukon, who led the work on behalf of Yukon at the National Inquiry. So upon the National Inquiry submitting their final reports and their calls to justice, there, of course, were calls to justice specific to policing. And Government of Yukon actually created the Yukon Advisory Committee, comprised of Minister Jeannie McLean, the chief of the Kwalndun First Nation, Chief Doris Bell, and the executive director of Liard Aboriginal Women's Council in Watson Lake. And they really wanted to keep the momentum going and create a Yukon action plan to address the calls to justice contained in the National Inquiry's report. And so they have done that. And given the amount of calls to justice contained in the report, the approach they decided to take was to create pillars as a sort of starting point. One of those pillars was to address issues related to justice and community safety. And throughout their discussions, it sort of made sense that in order to talk about the policing concerns and issues, that it sort of made sense now that around 10 years have passed since they completed the work of Sharing Common Ground, that it would make sense to revisit that and sort of take a bit of review of the recommendations, hire a neutral, independent company to take a look through, do some engagement, determine which recommendations and any lasting legacy mechanisms that came out of that are functioning well, which ones have sort of fallen a bit to the wayside, which ones maybe didn't make any sense in our current realities, and which ones could use a little bit of revitalization, I guess. Because really Sharing Common Ground was meant to be a document that is ongoing. It was a legacy piece. And so we're at that stage now where we're working with a First Nations company called Inspire Reconciliation Potential. And they're in the process of undertaking this review now. And they will hopefully in the spring have a document sort of touching on the recommendations and give us a good sense of next steps, because we know it didn't make sense to sort of rewrite things or reinvent the wheel. We know a tremendous amount of great work took place with sharing common ground, and that revisiting this work is going to help with next steps with respect to addressing the calls to justice contained in NIWG's final report. So very excited to be at this stage and looking forward to what comes out of their review in the spring. So I was quite intrigued and interested to hear that Newfoundland was undertaking similar sort of work. So it really felt great to be able to come talk a little bit about the work that's happening in Yukon in this area. And looking forward to hearing from Justin on their work.
Thanks, Chantal. You mentioned a couple of things which turn out to be threads that we'll run through my own presentation. So I think thanks for your words, and I think it sets up this presentation well. So, for example, you mentioned a lack of trust in policing. I don't think my screen is being shared here yet. So this presentation is called Building Trust and Restoring Confidence, and it's meant to describe the work that we're doing through the First Voice Working Group on Police Oversight. Chantal mentioned, as I was saying, a lack of trust here in Whitehorse with respect to police forces. You also mentioned some allegations of sexual assaults or maybe convictions by police officers. I think they were former police officers. That will be a thread that kind of weaves through my talk today. So this is what I was hoping to cover here. First, starting off with who we are, what is First Voice in the first place, how we got to the issue of policing and police oversight in particular. Then I'll talk a little bit about how we put together the working group on police oversight, followed by some of the things that we've achieved so far. And then in the wrap up, I'll just make a few remarks about where we're hoping things will go after this. So to start, who we are, we're First Voice. We're the Urban Indigenous Coalition found in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. Our name is meant to highlight the fact that our coalition is community-driven, Indigenous-led, and everything that we do should start with the first voice of the urban Indigenous community. That's why we're called First Voice, to recognize the need to prioritize Indigenous voices in trying to advance reconciliation. That doesn't mean that Indigenous people are required to do all of the work. In fact, our what we call partnership table, essentially the board of the coalition brings together non-Indigenous people and organizations with community members called community advocates. So the idea is that community advocates provide a diverse range of perspectives and views on reconciliation and how to advance it, and then organizational representatives work with us to help advance those priorities. We were established in 2019 under the leadership of First Light Friendship Center in St. John's, again echoing the First Voice part there. We have 10 partner organizations working alongside the community advocates. And I think that's all I have to say by introduction of First Voice. So as I mentioned, we're working to advance truth and reconciliation at St. John's. And based on community consultations, reconciliation was identified as a priority of the community. They also identified reconciliation as being closely tied to the TRC calls to action, the MMIWG calls for justice, as well as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So all of the work we're doing ties back in some way to one or more of these documents. And one reason for that, besides the fact that we know from community that these are priorities, is because our view is that these documents already show us a way forward, and the only task left for us is to determine how best to implement those recommendations locally in St. John's. We don't see the need to restudy issues that have been studied to death and come up with recommendations of our own when there's already national calls to action, calls for justice, and even international documents telling us or pointing us in the direction of reconciliation. So the question, how do we apply that to our local circumstances in St. John's and across Newfoundland and Labrador? Strengthening relationships between rights holders, stakeholders, and decision makers, particularly in government, is an area of focus for us by recognizing that the community, while we have some power, we don't actually have direct control over the levers of power, so it requires us to work in collaboration with many other organizations and people. So how did we get to the issue of policing? It's maybe not necessarily obvious why that's a priority for people in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. Before I answer that question, I just want to provide some context here. Newfoundland and Labrador has two police forces. The RCMP is active in most of the province, typically in rural areas. And then we also have a provincial police force called the Royal Newfoundland Constabulary, the RNC. The RNC typically focuses its policing on larger urban centers, including St. John's. They also have detachments on the western part of the island and in western Labrador. Unlike many other provinces, there are no municipal police forces. This is a typical model that exists in provinces like Quebec, BC, some of the prairie provinces, and Ontario in particular. So the RNC plays kind of a combined role of being a provincial police force, but also doing many of the functions that municipal police forces would do in other provinces. And as you'll see in a minute, that causes some jurisdictional challenges, particularly around accountability. I also, relevant to our work here on police oversight is the fact that Newfoundland and Labrador has no police commission or local police boards, as exist in virtually every other province in the country. So that has serious implications for accountability and transparency in policing in our province. And just to give you some examples of what happens when you have a vacuum of accountability and transparency in policing, these are just a few headlines that have helped inform some of the background of our own projects when it comes to the first force working group on police oversight. This is an article that came out in October 2019. Describing the circumstances under which women's rights advocate in St. John's was forced out of her job, essentially because the chief of the RNC didn't like what she was saying. So there is an obvious problem here, not just with accountability, but with the amount of unchecked power that the provincial police force has in the province. And I would encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about that, but reading this article, it goes quite in depth. So that's one. Another, Chantal mentioned sexual assault. And in my opinion, it's besides the shocking nature of this headline of on-duty RNC police officers committing sexual assault against civilians, I find it shocking that it hasn't received much wider attention across the province. So just to fill you in, because I imagine you haven't heard much about this. Last summer, 2021, 12 women came forward in St. John's and alleged that they were sexually assaulted by on-duty members of the RNC. And they were all of these allegations followed a very similar pattern of RNC officers essentially prowling the streets of downtown St. John's late at night with people leaving the bars, some people intoxicated, offering women rides home and then sexually assaulting them either in their police cruisers or at their homes. So 12 allegations of that. And up until now, there's been no accountability for any of that. The RNC essentially has not commented on the matter. There's no real prospect of convictions here. And on top of that, despite having a serious incident response team in Newfoundland and Labrador, an organization that is meant to investigate police misconduct to a criminal threshold, there's a total lack of trust among women in pursuing that process. largely because the Serious Incident Response Team, CERT NL, uses seconded police officers from existing police forces in the province. So we're asking women who are alleged to have been sexually assaulted to approach an organization that uses police officers to investigate police misconduct. So it's not surprising that there's a lack of trust here. And it's not just women and Indigenous people who are affected by this lack of accountability. There was a recent strike by grocery store workers in Mount Pearl, which is part of the St. John's metro area. They were on strike legally. There was no injunction telling them that they couldn't be on strike where they were. The RNC on its own initiative moved in with police equipped with riot gear and essentially intimidated the strikers on their own initiative. So there are obvious implications here for democratic freedoms like right to association, the right to strike, on top of the lack of accountability for things like sexual assaults, which we just talked about, as well as freedom of expression when it comes to the example I mentioned of the women's rights advocate who was forced out of her job because the police didn't like what she was saying. So all of these things are fundamental freedoms that not just Indigenous people in St. John's have a right to, but everyone in the province. And it's quite frankly shocking that this is happening in a part of Canada where we pride ourselves on being a free and democratic country. And it goes beyond just the RNC as well, as you can imagine. These are some pictures of an Inuit woman who was being forced onto an RCMP plane in Labrador. And this is part of the problem of building trust with communities, particularly in the case of the RCMP, putting aside.
Yeah. Yeah. That is like first generation reality. Yeah.
Even putting aside the colonialist history of the RCMP, the fly-in fly-out that's being used. Sorry, we're having some feedback problems here. The fly-in fly-out model that the RCMP uses in Labrador does nothing to build community trust, as you can see from this example. I'm just going to skip ahead here because I want to make sure that I'm on time. So as I mentioned, First Voice wants to tie all of our actions back to either the calls for justice or the calls to action. And looking at Call for Justice 5.7 here, it talks about creating Indigenous involvement in civilian police oversight bodies. That's a problem, particularly in Newfoundland and Labrador, which has no police commission or police oversight board. So we're already well behind where we need to be in order to start to implement this call for justice. So ensuring appropriate Indigenous representation in 9.2. We obviously can't do that until we actually have a body that's responsible for providing oversight. So just a few notes on how we built the police oversight working group. Our objective here is to create a nonpartisan consensus on the need to create a foundation for implementing those two calls for justice. Our membership is community driven and it brings in experts in the legal community, academics, members of the community, essentially anyone with expertise or an interest in improving the way that policing is done in the province. We've been able to do that with the support of a range of partners, including the Law Foundation of Newfoundland and Labrador, MyFax, and Dalhousie University's Law School. So let me just jump ahead a little bit here to show you what we've achieved so far. We've spent 15 months conducting legal and policy research, looking at how police oversight works across the country, taking what works best from those models and devising solutions to the things that don't work as well. We put out a draft report in July earlier this year with the objective of helping to inform some of the public conversation around policing, but also to kind of float some ideas that we had been discussing at the working group to see what kind of a public support and reception they would get. Then in order to facilitate that, we had a process of community engagement where we followed up with targeted stakeholders and asked them to provide their feedback on our draft reports. And really the objective of all of this was to help inform the public conversation around policing. We saw that there's a policy vacuum in terms of solutions that people were proposing, so we decided to fill that gap, and doing that through research and engagement. So as you can see, some of the headlines here start to change compared to the ones that you just saw. Raising the point about police accountability, particularly with regard to other jurisdictions in the province. So this is our report here that's cited in the headline. We also, as part of the engagement process, commissioned our own public opinion poll that found that 88% of residents in Newfoundland and Labrador supported the creation of a police oversight board along the lines that we have proposed in our draft reports. And that cut across partisan lines, identities, genders, geography, everything. So there really is overwhelming support for what we're proposing, well beyond the urban Indigenous community. We also have the support of 10 law professors out of Dalhousie University. They issued an open letter to the Newfoundland and Labrador government saying, you really need to make a commitment to implementing these 2 calls for justice. And then again, this comes back to the point of confidence and trust in police. So one of the things that we've done besides influencing the public conversation around policing and police oversight is we've established First Voice as an expert in this area, precisely because of the research and engagement work that we've been doing, that we've been leading. So anytime there are issues with policing that crop up, and it seems to happen nearly every week in Newfoundland and Labrador, media tend to come to us to get our opinion on how our solutions would either prevent or help to fix the issues that are now that continue to come up in public. And all of this is feeding into our final report, which you get a little preview of here. We'll be releasing this report on October 4th this year to coincide with the National Day of Action for Missing Members of Indigenous rights. So we're pretty excited to get that out in the public sphere. I'm handing it over to government, and then depending on the reception we get there, either working with government to implement our recommendations or using this report as a basis for further advocacy work in the future. So just a quick wrap up here. That report was the product of 15 months of legal research and community engagement, as well as engagement with targeted stakeholders. The idea here isn't simply to document the problems with policing. It's meant to propose real and actionable solutions to government, and encouraging them to implement the recommendations that we developed through community-driven research in the area. And our ultimate objective here is to implement a policing system that is responsive to community needs, that helps to build stronger relationships, not just with members of the urban Indigenous community and police, but with all residents of the province. If you want to learn more about our project and other work that we're doing, there's where you can find us, firstvoicenl.ca. And that's where we'll also be publishing the final report after we release it on October 4th. So I'm a little bit over time. Sorry for that. I appreciate everyone's patience. That's it for me.
Thank you so much, Justin. That's fantastic work. I look forward to your comments on some questions once we finish. So if we could move on, Kim, if you'd like to proceed, thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So there's slides. I'm not going to go through them because then I will take way too much time, except I'd like to go to the chart if we can. That is on, now I should know which slide. I think it's the second or third slide. It shows the trajectory of people in prison. And while that's being maybe put up, and I apologize, I'm a techno twit, so I'm hoping someone can help. There you go, that's it. That's exactly it. So the report that I want to speak specifically to, and the actions more to the point that can come out of this, really were the culmination of about 40 years of work. Many of the all of the 12 women who are identified in this report are women I met first, many of them as young people who, and most of them are in their 50s, 60s, and one has died since we started doing this work. And I put together this particular package because justices Harry Laforme and Juanita Westmoreland Troyer were asked by the Minister of Justice to look at the issue of conviction reviews, and in particular, to make recommendations about how we could look at wrongful convictions in this country and remedy some of the issues. And for those of you who aren't aware, over the 20 years from around 2000 to 2020, that the Department of Justice reviewed cases where they agreed to review cases. Of those cases they agreed to review, they only agreed to review 20 of the hundreds of applications. And of those 20, all were men. One was an Indigenous man, one was a Black man or a man of African descent, and all of the rest were white men. And so one of the things that the justices wanted, and I had done work with, in particular, Justice Harry Laforme on judicial education in the past, was what was happening in particular for Indigenous peoples, but even more particularly for Indigenous women. And the situation is particularly stark when we talk about Indigenous women. We see, and the reason I wanted the chart up is, since the time that the Supreme Court of Canada called the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in federal prisons a crisis, we are now at a situation where they have exponentially increased, triply in terms of the number overall of Indigenous people, and almost 5 times by when you look at Indigenous women in particular. So you see the trajectory that since we started trying to indigenize our criminal legal system, I don't call it a justice system because there's not much just about it, particularly for those who are most marginalized. And as we have tried to adjust the system and reform the system, paradoxically, it has resulted in, I would argue, humbly, that the system has felt better about putting more and more people in. And it's not accidental that the very same issues that the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry pointed to as the reasons that many and too many, thousands too many Indigenous women and girls end up going missing, being disappeared, being murdered, and being homeless are the very same issues that also give rise to them being the fastest growing prison population. And just to give you a bit broader picture, so this is the federal picture. So this is for people serving 2 years or more. If we look at the provincial and territorial numbers, where you are at the moment meeting, as well as in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and the other 2 northern territories, the number of Indigenous women in provincial or territorial custody ranges anywhere from 75 to 100%, depending on the date, time, and the snapshot taken. The situation is even more dire when we look at young women and prisons designated for youth, and particularly young women and girls in the youth system. And there the numbers go from a shocking 95 to 100% of the young women or girls, or those identify as such, in custody are Indigenous. So we're in, I don't know what you call it when it gets past a crisis, but we see it as the impact of residential schools. We see the impact of the child welfare system, or as my friends call, who are involved in other parts of the world in this, the child stealer system. We see it in terms of the hyper-responsibilization in particular of women who experience violence, but even more particularly if they're Indigenous women. And I encourage you to look at the work of people like the late Trish Montour, a dear friend who's I'm wearing today the earrings that she gifted me not long before she passed. And she talked about the fact that not only do we tell women and girls routinely that they are responsible for their own protection, if they're Indigenous, we tell them they're responsible for their own protection and their protection of all those around them. And so we talk about that as the hyper-responsibilization of women and girls, the deputizing of them to protect themselves. At the same time as we have, and you've just heard ample evidence from the previous 2 incredible presenters, the fact that they are underprotected by the state and over policed and more likely. So when they call the police for their own protection, they're less likely to get that protection than many others. And if they act to defend themselves after they've essentially been deputized to do so, they are more likely to be criminalized and imprisoned as a result of that action. And so we see them end up in the system. We see then the bias of prosecutorial discretion about what they'll be charged with, whether they'll proceed with the charges. And the point of this report is to talk about, in particular, when we're talking about mandatory minimum penalties, the ways in which those penalties are hung over the heads of those individuals, and to both pressure guilty pleas and induce guilty pleas, and to prevent people from going to trial in a context where they may not have a fair process to start with. They may not have sufficient resources to have someone who can provide the type of defense they need to mount in order to put forth a defense of self-defense or defense of other. And they're more likely, therefore, to also be not only prosecuted, but convicted. And when they're convicted, then they face a system that the courts have already found is discriminatory in the sense of how it treats them in terms of risk assessments and that sort of thing, the ways that myths and stereotypes, discriminatory myths and stereotypes, genocidal discriminatory myths and stereotypes are used to classify them as higher security. So that as we're having this conversation, not only are women 50% of the federal prison population, they are 68% of the maximum security and the segregated jail population. So they're more likely to not only be jailed, but they're also more likely to be described as more dangerous, more violent, even though many of them are in for responding to the violence first perpetrated against them. So what was the purpose of this? Well, one of the things we wanted to do was two things. Both Justices Harry Laforme and Juanita Westmoreland Traore said, the issues that have been raised by us and by the women, because they met with these 12 women, are exemplars of the systemic issues that need to be addressed within the criminal legal system. And one of the ways to do that is to address that burgeoning population by decolonizing, decriminalizing, and decarcerating. And so we encouraged that the new law commission that has been reinvigorated should look at all of these cases and more, because there are certainly more than these 12 in the system, and with a view to examining whether in fact they should even be serving sentences and to remedy that. We also say that right now, as we are having these discussions, the Senate is considering a piece of legislation that would, if passed now, would do virtually nothing to address this. Although the government has introduced Bill C-5, claiming that it will reduce the numbers of Indigenous and those of African descent in prisons, reduce the numbers and the over-incarceration, and that it will result in fewer miscarriages of justice, and that we will actually see it remedying some of the wrongs that have been pointed out in the past. Nothing could be further than from the truth. In fact, one of the realities is, because of what I've just said, is the fact that all of the mandatory minimum penalties that would actually most contribute to the mass incarceration of Indigenous women in particular will remain with this legislation. One of the things we're urging, and the Senate will be working on, is amending this to allow judges the discretion to do their job in the cases where a mandatory minimum penalty has not been repealed, urging them to consider not applying that mandatory minimum penalty. Many are arguing, and certainly right now, the government is, characterizing, as are others, as this is somehow going to be soft on crime. We need to drive home to everybody, and today is the perfect day to be having this discussion, that jailing more Indigenous women, if you think this is being soft on crime, then what you are actually advocating is we need to jail more Indigenous women for longer periods of time in the interests of public safety. And if that's not what you think, then all of us should be contacting our members of parliament, our senators, and saying, why are you not advocating this sort of amendment to at the very least fix this little bit, then not to mention all of the other measures? We also have to take further measures to actually move people out of the system, and there are mechanisms that are available. There's another report, if you're interested, called Senators Go to Jail, that my late colleague, Thunder Jose Foreni Singh and I and others had worked on. And there are many other measures we could take, but suffice to say, we have to act now. Within the next month, we have the possibility of making this small change. And so I hope to enlist all of you to participate in this so that we can actually at least have one measure very quickly that will make some meaningful change. And so the next time you hear someone say, and many of these women have been convicted of murder in a context where they oftentimes they were killing in self-defense or they were defending others. And like Jamie Gladue herself, it's why I don't refer to Section 718(2)(e) as Gladue factors, because Jamie didn't get the benefit of them herself. And for those of you who don't know that backstory, Jamie was described at the Supreme Court of Canada as a jealous wife who stabbed her common law husband because she was jealous he was having an affair. Jamie was a 19-year-old pregnant with her second child by an incredibly abusive man, Reuben Beaver, who had moved her away from her support system in Calgary to Nanaimo just before, about a year before she stabbed him. Her father, Jamie's father, was so concerned about her safety that he moved himself and her younger siblings to Calgary to try and help protect Jamie, and had a rule that none of the younger siblings were allowed to be left alone with Reuben Beaver. The night that Jamie stabbed him, he first beat Jamie. He then went next door, broke in through the bedroom window, raped her younger sister, came back, beat Jamie, and Jamie stabbed him as he was trying to get back into the unit where her younger sister and her other younger siblings were. Now I ask you, how can it be anything but misogyny and racism that those facts get twisted to be the type of fact situation that end up before the Supreme Court of Canada? And the reason is because nobody had the appetite to take on the fact that we were dealing fundamentally with racist, sexist violence against an Indigenous woman. And instead, we have the case goes to the Supreme Court of Canada on the fine legal point of, did Section 718(2)(e), which said that if you're going to sentence someone to prison, you have to first look at every other option, including the background, and consider the circumstances, in particular if they're Indigenous and what that background is. And the argument that went to the Supreme Court of Canada was, did that apply to someone off reserve as well as someone on reserve? Because the judge in Jamie's case said that didn't apply to her because she lived off reserve. Is a perfectly horrific example of why we need to address these issues head on and take the sorts of measures that have already been recommended by other panelists, but that really scream out to be dealt with, not just today, obviously, but especially today and every day. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
I want to thank all of our panelists actually for sharing their presentations. It was incredibly insightful, the work that you're all doing. Your last comments, Senator Pate or Kim, actually led to my question that in 1999, the Supreme Court illuminated deep problems and systemic weaknesses in justice administration in Canada and actually quoted that there was a crisis in Canadian criminal justice system. And despite the studies and the commissions and the reports and hundreds of recommendations, those disparities between Indigenous people and particularly Indigenous women have not changed, as you pointed out. So I've heard panelists say that there is an issue of racism, colonialism, lack of oversight, unchecked power. And with an eye to, and I recognize that we're almost out of time, but with an eye to the role of a national urban Indigenous organization, what do you think the biggest barriers are to being able to effect real transformative change within the system? And perhaps what could a national organization do?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think for me, I think the biggest problem is we are resisting upending the entire system. It seems too scary to say the system doesn't work. We need to look at fundamental principles and rethink what we're doing. And so we do it incrementally, and we do it incrementally in ways that actually exacerbate the problem, in my humble opinion. That if we say more Indigenous people in the system will solve it, but we expect Indigenous people to only come into that system if they act the way the colonizers have historically. Then we recreate the same issues. And I think of, for instance, in the community where you're meeting right now, the first time I went to that community, there was a dilapidated jail there. It was horrific conditions, admittedly. But when people said we need a new jail, I encouraged the entire community, including the then Minister of Justice, to say, don't build a new jail. Look at what else you need. There's a reason that people who have past trauma of abuse, of residential school, of child welfare involvement are languishing in the streets, are self-medicating or being medicated. And we need to address those issues, put the resources there. There, as well as the last time I was in Iqaluit, they were building a new jail, and there's seemingly no end of money to perpetuate that system. And instead, we need to call for really sovereignty, communities to have control. And when I say communities, I mean First Nations, Inuit and Métis communities to say, no, we want to claim this back. This is how we will care for our people. And there may be people, because of what has happened and because of the incredible damage, may not be welcome back in their own community because of acts that they've, their own behavior. But there can be partnerships between communities where I may not be welcome. I'm sorry, I'm not Indigenous, so I'm not presuming to welcome myself into anybody's community. But if I were, and I was from your community, and you said, Kim, you're not welcome back anymore, but let's say Justin's community said, we will sponsor, we will support, as long as you're accountable, you can be in this community starting to build your life and show some ways that you are willing to be held accountable. And I don't know a person, very few people, unless they have had full psychotic breaks, quite frankly, who don't want to figure out some way to make up for the harm they've done. We don't give that opportunity. We punish, we throw away. Very rarely do we provide opportunities. And when we do, we tend to take those that are the system finds most challenging to deal with. I'm not talking about first taking out those who have committed sex offenses, for instance, and those who have caused some of the greatest harm. I am saying, though, just because someone has been convicted of murder, particularly if we're talking about one of these women, we shouldn't be turning our backs. We should be saying what happened here and how do we, as best as possible, without being able to bring back or undo the harm, create a situation where this person can meaningfully contribute to not only their own healing, but the healing of their families, their communities, and ultimately then all of us, because this impacts all of us. And right now, I'll name them, the Conservative Party, and quite frankly, none of the political parties are willing to stand up at this point and stand up to the bullying of saying, anything but being longer, harsher penalties as being soft on crime. And I think we need to challenge our elected leaders and our appointed leaders like me. I'm a public servant, to stand up and know, follow the evidence. Don't just, run scared because people are using bully tactics, but say, are you saying to me that you think jailing more and more Indigenous women, because that's who's mostly going to be impacted by any of these, that jailing more and more Indigenous women is going to keep us safe? Tell me how that's going to happen.
Thank you. Do our other panelists have a comment on the role of a national organization and what we could possibly do?
Well, as a national organization like NUIC, needing for it to work that's happening locally would be a great help to us. Just speaking for our own project on police oversight mechanisms in St. John's and Newfoundland and Labrador more generally. The general strategy that we've been using is reaching out to other organizations that either have expertise in this area or that have an interest in seeing accountability mechanisms strengthened in line. So, for example, Assembly of First Nations in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland has supported our calls for more oversight of police. That kind of angle from a national organization would help amplify the work that we're doing more locally.
Yeah, I know that for sure. And I also want to actually thank Senator Kim for her wise words and all the work that you've been doing. Definitely Council of Yukon First Nations and our Justice Department, we touch on different areas, not just policing. We do work in the courts and around Gladue. And we actually also did a lot of work around corrections reform, because as Kim mentioned, did go ahead and build a large facility, one that is built to meet maximum standards. And that's just doesn't make a lot of sense in Yukon. However, it did go ahead, and there was some corrections reform work that did end up having to happen, because a lot of the issues that you would expect to come up did come up, because all of the focus went into just building a maximum security prison for a population that probably would have been better served by more resources being allocated to preventative measures. I think definitely opportunity like this benefits us a lot here in the Yukon, especially because northern jurisdictions often get left out of the conversations. And I find, when I'm going to meetings, what we call down south, I'm often reminding tables and informing dialogues around the unique nature of self-governing First Nations in Yukon, and just also reminding folks that, hey, we're up in the Yukon, we're facing similar issues. Yes, we're a smaller jurisdiction, but in a lot of ways, because of our small size, we've been able to affect some really good change. And I think that, other jurisdictions turn to us often to say, wow, how have you been able to do that? And look to us for example, like sharing common ground is considered to be a best practice. And so having this smaller jurisdiction does benefit us in the sense that we can mobilize and move things forward sometimes easier than other jurisdictions. So definitely these types of opportunities benefit greatly. So thank you.
Thank you. I understand, Kim, that you have obligations in your community. I'd like to thank you so much for being a part of our panel this morning, and thank you so much for your important work that you're doing.
You're very kind, and thank you. And if anybody would like some of that material or know what to write to their MP, just send me a quick note and we'll send that material on to folks.
No, we'll be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Take good
All right.
care.
Take
Bye-bye.
care. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
We can circulate that to all the registrants as well on Zoom.
So we continue to have another half an hour with our other two panelists, excuse me. So I am really interested in the work that you both are doing in policing. I think that there has been consistently the issue of racism and lack of accountability that have been brought up. And I'd like to continue the conversation actually in light of what Kim has said as well about what we can do as a national organization. And Chantal, I hear that recognizing best practices and elevating the roles of our northern communities and showcasing them as best practices is assistance. But Justin, I'd like to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on our role as a national organization in terms of how we collectively can address the issue of, in particular, lack of accountability and unchecked power.
Yeah, well, like amplifying the work that's already happening more locally is our own project. Would be a very big help, because it would help lend some additional credibility to the work that we're doing. And it would also help to advance more of a solution-oriented conversation as opposed to dwelling I think we've seen that locally as well in some of the media coverage and the public conversation that we've been trying to provoke around policing and the lack of accessibility in Newfoundland and Labrador. Whereas before we were getting more of an inventory of all of the problems. Now the conversation, which is important, it's certainly part of the conversation, but now the conversation seems moving forward into, okay, how do we accepted that there are problems here, how do we, and we see people circle back to our draft report that we put out, and we expect them to be doing the same thing as soon as that report is finalized. And so I'm asking to endorse that kind of work would be of and I imagine with other coalitions too. Just one other point as well. When it comes to policing, particularly in our own context, because we've got a provincial police force and the RCMP, there are some rather complicated jurisdictional issues there. So I can see some work needing to be done at the national level in sorting out areas of responsibility that the federal government has in this case, bringing accountability to policing and working with the provinces that are trying to do the same thing.
I think in all sectors that might be an issue, that jurisdictional issue over Indigenous people, and the provincial and federal responsibilities. So I'm curious, Justin, how has the reception of the police, and do they participate? How is the reception of the work that you're doing been with both police divisions?
So I would say frosty at best. Although we have seen some movement in the leadership of the RNC in recognizing that accountability is a problem. We reached out both to the RNC and the RCMP when we released the draft report, and we specifically welcome their comments and feedback on those issues. We didn't get a response from either police force.
I'm wondering if there are any other comments or questions that there are to the participants who are in the room at Whitehorse. I'd like to give other folks an opportunity to be able to either ask questions or comment on the presentations. Damon.
So, some of you may not know, but I am on the Winnipeg Police Board. And I'm one of 2 Indigenous persons on that board out of 7 people. You know, it's a good group, like we have good communication with each other. I think there's a lot of respect around the table. And with some of you don't know, the only employee that we really have any authority over is the chief himself. And then so we're not allowed to meddle in operations. But you know, even though we have these kind of strictures in place, there is some flexibility, and we have some really good discussions with our chief, and then sometimes with the senior management team. And of course, you know, being in Winnipeg, it's a huge Indigenous population now, 102,000 persons, mix of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. The Métis are the largest group in the city, which is natural because they've been off reserve forever. But you know, the issues you're speaking to here today are seem to be common in many places, and solutions to these issues prove very difficult to address or to implement. But there is I think, some light on the horizon. So I'm part of a group of Indigenous leaders in Winnipeg that are taking an initiative in Winnipeg called the Sabe, or the Peacekeepers. And so my office, where I'm located, we have one of the highest concentrations of people on the street homeless in the whole city. And and in the last, say, 3 to 5 years, the rise in crime, in vandalism, theft, et cetera, is, going through the roof kind of. And then more serious offenses like murders. So we not too long ago had 2 young Indigenous males just randomly killed 2 people on the street. And it's likely there's some new drugs out now that can cause individuals to become very angry. And so we suspect to a high degree that was part of the issue. So this Sabe initiative is really an attempt by our community to find a way to have these individuals trained, and then be the primary line of interaction with people on the street, not just Indigenous, but whoever's in the area. And so we've got some good evidence, hard evidence already that they are doing some work already, and it's being recognized that it is very effective. And so the council that I lead is going to make an attempt to work with the First Nations, the Métis, and the Inuit to have meetings with the Minister of Justice federally, the Minister of Justice Manitoba, the Minister of Public Safety federally, and the Mayor and Council and the Winnipeg Police Service. Now we have a program in Winnipeg called the Cadets, which is under the Winnipeg Police Service, and so the Sabe peacekeeper would have a similar role to the cadets. And if you look at the cadet model, it's a good model, but there's not much diversity in the cadets. I don't even know if there's any. I'm going to find out if there's any Indigenous persons in the cadets. I haven't seen any. It could be Métis. And then we have another big initiative in Winnipeg called the Downtown Community Safety Patrol. And there are organizations in our community that work very closely. In fact, the board of the Downtown Community Safety Patrol has significant Indigenous representation. And then Greg Burnett, who's the head of the Downtown Community Safety Patrol, he's an ex-police officer and just a super person, and is fully aware of many policing issues, and in the right place in terms of his thinking and acting. So we've met with him once, and we're going to have another meeting, but we're looking at some kind of a partnership with the Downtown Community Safety Patrol to strengthen our voice in terms of the Sabe Peacekeepers Initiative. Now, in the discussion we've had here today, I think one of our weaknesses as Indigenous organizations is we need some of these bigger issues that we're trying to tackle. They will require the support of other Canadians. In the final analysis, governments, they poll all the time. They base all of their election platform on what these polls are telling them about what Canadians are supporting. And oftentimes the things that the majority of Canadians are supporting are not in line with what we want. And so, we have opportunity, this word political just irritates me because, you got to be political. You got to speak up. You got to get involved. Our most powerful tool we have as Indigenous peoples is to influence, because we don't have armies. We're 5% of the Canadian population. And the things we want are real, and they're valid, and they're legitimate from any you talk about today. There's no doubt that if you implement these things, we'd end up with a better society. We have restorative justice legislation in Manitoba. It's working to some degree, but it's older now, and it needs to be reviewed and updated. But the Winnipeg Police Service is diverting people to, to better programming, to help them deal with their issues, whether it's mental health or addictions or whatever it is, right? Psychosis sometimes. Yeah, we got the whole range of things, right? So, and again, what I hear from my friend Justin and yourself, the local scene can be quite different from one province to territory to city to town, you know what I mean? And in some cases, there seems to be more willingness of a particular system in a given jurisdiction to work in a better way with you. And we need to look at those things too, because if we're truly trying to bring change to this massive system called justice, it's going to take all of us and more. And then, do we have, a strategic plan of actions we're going to take to achieve some of the goals, like I've talked about the Sabi and the peacekeepers? I've spent much of my life, building relationships, and particularly with non-Indigenous Canadians. And so we work with some powerful non-Indigenous organizations in Winnipeg, the Social Planning Council of Winnipeg. And they do some amazing work. They have amazing research capacity. They're just good people. Well, and then they have their partners, you know what I mean? So this is what I'm suggesting going forward. We have to have more discussion of this kind of issues or opportunities, and then build some consensus within our organization. These are the next steps we kind of have to take to strengthen our ability to bring the kind of change we want for our communities. And so I'll stop there, but I just wanted to put that on the table.
Thank you,
We're here-
Damon.
Yeah, we're here, each of us, to give our best, put our best on the table. And it's not about who's right or wrong. Put it there, and people like it, okay. If they don't, that's okay too. You know what I mean? Yeah. Okay, so thank
Thanks,
you.
Damon. Jean-François.
Hi, everyone. So I think it's time to just click on interpretation. So I will do my part in French. So I'm sorry for the people in the room in Whitehorse. I think it's going to be a little bit harder for you to have the full conversation, but if you can have the translation, that would be great. Merci aux conférenciers d'avoir fait leur conférence aujourd'hui. C'était très intéressant et je me rends compte que à travers le pays, on a un peu la même histoire avec les femmes autochtones qui ont été de façon répétée malmenées par les services policiers. Et c'est arrivé en 2015 à Val-d'Or où une dizaine de femmes autochtones ont dénoncé des comportements irréguliers des policiers, donc des agressions sexuelles, plusieurs agressions à leur endroit. Et c'est ce qui a déclenché au Québec une prise de conscience provinciale, parce que les femmes autochtones, c'était le premier groupe marginalisé qui avait dénoncé un des services gouvernementaux québécois en lequel on était supposé avoir le plus confiance, soit les services policiers. Donc, on venait attaquer directement le cœur du gouvernement du Québec en disant les policiers, c'est des gens qui sont agressifs envers les femmes autochtones, c'est des gens qui sont agressifs envers les femmes, etc., etc. Et la première réponse du gouvernement du Québec, ça a été de créer une commission d'enquête qui s'appelle la Commission Vient, qui se posait sur les services publics envers les personnes en justice, une meilleure qualité de service en justice pour les Autochtones dans les villes du Québec. Et moi, je ne parle pas des communautés autochtones, je vais vraiment parler des villes au Québec où il y a une population qui est quand même significative, donc où les centres d'amitié sont au cœur de la prestation de services. Et la commission vient nommer plusieurs actions que le gouvernement du Québec devait faire, dont de faciliter la mise en place de services en justice dans les centres d'amitié ou dans les organisations communautaires pour réduire la marginalisation des Autochtones dans le système carcéral québécois. Pour vous donner un exemple, rapidement, le gouvernement du Québec, en partenariat avec les centres d'amitié, ont rapidement mis une équipe d'intervention mixte, c'est-à-dire des policiers, des intervenants communautaires et des infirmières, infirmiers à Val-d'Or pour intervenir avec les populations marginalisées qui sont en situation d'itinérance, consommation, santé mentale, ce qui a permis de réduire l'incarcération, la judiciarisation des personnes autochtones à Val-d'Or. Cette initiative-là découlait d'une initiative qui était déjà en place à Montréal, spécialement pour les personnes en situation d'itinérance. Bon, Winnipeg a un grand problème d'itinérance, mais il y a d'autres villes au Canada qui ont un grand problème d'itinérance, dont Toronto, Montréal et les grandes villes canadiennes. Et le SPVM, qui est la police de la ville de Montréal, avait déjà mis des équipes d'intervention mixtes pour intervenir avec les personnes qui sont plus vulnérables. Donc, on a repris cette initiative-là et on l'a mis à Val-d'Or, qui, ça a pris quelques années, mais maintenant, on commence à voir un peu les résultats beaucoup plus positifs. Donc, on parlait de confiance entre les femmes autochtones et les autochtones et les services policiers. On commence à voir une amélioration dans la confiance envers les services policiers parce que les équipes mixtes ont permis de faire de la sensibilisation sur l'intervention, le background, les réalités que vivent les Autochtones lorsqu'elles sont dans les villes, hors de leur communauté. Là, je vous parle des services policiers, mais les services en justice présentement, le gouvernement du Québec a, en partenariat avec le regroupement des centres d'amitié et les centres d'amitié partout au Québec, déployé une stratégie provinciale pour offrir des services de justice communautaire et des services qui vont venir remplacer la judiciarisation des personnes autochtones avec des crimes mineurs, les contrevenants, là, ce qu'on appelle là, avec des crimes mineurs dans les villes. Donc, les centres d'amitié vont être dans plus de 12 villes, dans 10 villes, même je dirais, ouais, je vais dire 12 villes au Québec, à être probablement en collaboration avec les organismes communautaires et de justice au Québec, à être les premiers intervenants dans la réduction des méfaits pour les Autochtones dans les villes. Donc, on va tenter de trouver des mesures de rechange qui sont communautaires, qui favorisent la réintégration, la réinsertion des gens dans leur communauté. Quand je dis communauté, je parle des communautés urbaines, hein, parce qu'au Québec, on parle de créer des sociétés civiles autochtones urbaines. Donc, c'est de créer des communautés ou des tissus de sécurité qui sont favorables pour les Autochtones, peu importe leur lieu de résidence, peu importe leur appartenance à un conseil de bande ou un autre. Donc, on essaie de créer ces filets de sécurité-là en proposant des mesures de rechange qui sont non punitives, mais plutôt pour réintégrer les gens. Donc, je crois que le fait qu'on ait donné un électrochoc au gouvernement du Québec en dénonçant un des services qui était au cœur de la confiance de la population, soit les services policiers, on est venu ébranler un peu leur confiance et c'est là qu'on s'est positionné comme étant les meilleurs partenaires pour offrir des services qui sont culturellement sécurisants pour les personnes autochtones dans les villes. Donc, je ne pense pas qu'on ait la solution, mais on travaille vraiment fort au Québec pour essayer de travailler en partenariat avec les villes, le provincial, et pour développer des programmes qui sont pertinents pour les Autochtones. Probablement qu'au Québec, à cause de l'identité québécoise, il y a un plus grand conflit, je vous dirais, avec le fédéral, ce qui est dans toutes les questions là, au Québec. Là, il y a toujours ce conflit qui émerge. Donc, c'est peut-être aussi une raison pour laquelle le gouvernement du Québec a été peut-être un peu plus proactif à mettre en place des financements qui sont quand même substantiels. Là. Pour les centres d'amitié, on parle d'environ 1 million de dollars là, par année pour les 2 prochaines années. Donc, pour permettre d'avoir des intervenants qui vont interagir complètement pour la décriminalisation des personnes autochtones avec des crimes mineurs ou les contrevenants avec des crimes mineurs. Donc, merci beaucoup pour les conférenciers et les panels. C'était vraiment très intéressant, mais je me rends compte que plus on se regarde, plus nos histoires sont semblables, malheureusement. Puis, je pense que pour être coprésident de la table nationale des coalitions New Week, c'est sûr qu'on a un rôle de se positionner comme étant une autre voix qui va porter cette problématique-là de justice des femmes autochtones qui sont agressées de façon répétée par les services policiers, etc., au niveau, le plus haut niveau, le plus haut niveau de conversation qui est avec le gouvernement fédéral pour la question autochtone. Donc, je pense aussi Niue a un rôle important à jouer dans les prochaines années. Donc, je lance ça. Je dis rien, mais je dis tout. Mais voilà, c'est mon commentaire pour la session aujourd'hui.
Thank you, Jean-François, and thank you so much to our interpreters. I think that we have heard a lot from our panelists. We have heard an incredible amount of great work that's being done by all three of our panelists. And there's a lot of great information, I think, that we heard not only about what the actual situation is, but what some of the biggest issues are, and how we perhaps as an organization can go forward. We have heard that there is an issue of colonial control, misogyny, racism, sexism, a lack of accountability, unchecked power, and that decolonization is a conversation that I think that we can continue to have as an organization and also as individuals in our own communities. And decolonization is, a difficult concept, but we also know that there are organizations in the past who have very successfully created opportunities outside of the criminal justice system that support healing and education, which is a departure from the Canadian criminal justice system that continues to rely upon punitive forms of justice. And so hopefully we can continue those conversations in our communities and as a national organization. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all three of the panelists for their work. And I look forward to those conversations. I also like to thank our interpreters and for the technical support and their behind the scenes to be able to make this happen. So thank you all very much. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.